The most important factor over the long haul has been changing, not wiser monetary policy, but a monetary policy focused on anchoring inflation expectations.
That's probably
Mark Watson and Jim Stock had a really nice paper where they studied the dynamics of inflation using a so-called unobserved components model. And the basic message was that 30 or 40 years ago, if there was a shock to inflation, a significant part of that shock was permanent. It would stay away from its initial point for a sustained period. Whereas since the 90s, if there's a shock to inflation, it's transitory, and you go back to the underlying level. And that's consistent with a world in which inflation expectations have been well anchored. And so shocks to inflation tend to be transitory as long as that policy is consistent with that. That is, by the way, Savannah's way of thinking about it, the endogeneity of policy, I think that's very complementary. On the one hand, if inflation expectations are very well anchored, then policy can relatively easily succeed in keeping inflation at target, and vice versa. If policy is committed to keeping inflation near target, then inflation expectations tend to be well anchored. So I think that explains the broad changes in the inflation process, and it probably helps, at least to a first instance, to explain the most recent behavior. Part of the reason why inflation didn't fall so much in the recession was because inflation expectations were well anchored. On the downside, they probably did fall to some extent. We've seen some evidence that inflation expectations fell, which is probably part of the reason that inflation's been slow to come up. Having said that, I think there are a lot of interesting points made today. For example, clearly part of the reason that inflation's been slow to come up is that the Fed underestimated how far the labor market could be pushed, along with what Jared talks about. U-star unemployment, natural rate of unemployment, is probably a good bit lower than the Fed thought a couple years ago, and that gives some scope for further expansion in the labor market. Some of the points that Kristen made about the global factors that kept inflation from falling quite so much after the panic, I think are relevant, and the transmission of that to prices. So there's a bunch of, in any short period, there's going to be a bunch of idiosyncratic and other factors that are relevant. I think over the longer period, I do think the change in the structure of monetary policy is the most important thing, but all these other things obviously are relevant too.
Thanks for watching. Be sure to like and subscribe for more videos from Brookings.